Hello and welcome to the 17th episode of our Trainz route building tutorial series. In this series I'm using TRS 19, but most things also apply to other Trainz versions. In this episode I'll be covering several session making tips. The first tip I have is to play sessions from other routes. Then, once you know the end result, load that session in the surveyor and take a look at the session rules. Try to figure out how they did it and then learn that way. The second tip I have is to occasionally make the player wait at red signals. Now, at first this might seem counterintuitive, but if you think about it, what it actually means is that the player needs to wait for things to happen. And that then makes your route feel much more alive, like it's an actual railroad where things are happening outside of what the player's currently doing. So I'm going to give you an example on this session, which is for one of the routes that I've made. This route's not been uploaded yet, but once it has been uploaded, I will put the name of the route in the description. We begin the session in the locomotive works and need to refill the locomotives before we head out, crossing over the main line and then heading into the yard. So I'll do this. As you can see, the first stop marker is where the fuel pump is. Now, as soon as we come to a stop, a message will pop up saying that the player is loading the fuel. After some time has passed, the next navigation marker will appear. Now we've finished loading and the next navigation marker has appeared. Now you can see that up ahead the next signal is yellow, meaning the next one is red. And now, as we're approaching the next signal, you can see that indeed it is red, and that the next marker is beyond it. This means that the player will actually have to pay attention to the signals in order to not fail the session. So we'll just slowly come to a stop here and wait for something to happen that will make the signal clear. After a little while, it becomes apparent that the player has to wait for a passenger train to pass first. Now the passenger train's passed, but the signal is still red, so something else must happen. Let's look around a bit. If we turn this way, we can see that another passenger train has to pass first. Now that the second passenger train has passed, our signal has changed to yellow, indicating that we can continue crossing over the main line. The next tip I have is to use the instant load or instant unload commands to instantly load or unload the player's train at industries in sessions. Now, don't recommend that you always use this, but if the player's train is quite long, like this one, and the player would have to load each car individually, it can get quite tedious and boring, so in some instances I use the instant load command. I've actually used this in this session, so I'll demonstrate it for you. But first we have to wait for a train to pass at the red signal that's up ahead. Now that the train's passed, we've got a clear signal and can continue to the loading area. Now we're approaching the logs loading platform, and this is actually a working industry, so you could theoretically load each car individually and it would work. But as you'll see when I stop on the marker, the player's train will be loaded instantaneously. and now the player can continue with the session. To me, this is much more fun than if the player had to stop and start to manually load each car individually. The next tip I have is to be creative with turning session layers on and off at runtime. You would do this using session rules. For example, over here I have a siding beside some houses. Usually this is not a station and there is no industry there, but for this session I wanted it to act as a station. So what I did is I placed down some people on a specific session layer, and then I used a session rule to turn that layer off once the player has stopped there, simulating them boarding the train. The last tip I have is to turn on the debug tools when playtesting your sessions. This will enable you to fast forward the game. To enable these, go up to the settings menu, then go to the general tab, and then enable it down here. With this enabled, you can hold shift to fast forward the game. Note that this has some bugs, as for example it doesn't really work with the realistic driving mode, so I would suggest using the DCC mode, or easy mode as it's called. Another thing to be wary of is that trains tend to derail if you couple up while fast forwarding. Also, some trains may skip over track marks or triggers and not trigger them while fast forwarding, but it's still a great tool to use if you're careful with it. So I'll demonstrate it to you now. The footage isn't sped up, instead the game is sped up. So I'm just starting like this, and then I'm going to speed up. In case you were wondering, this is the Coleman Mountains Railroad, which is a route that I've made, which will be uploaded as DLC soon. This is actually the last tutorial for this series that I have planned. However, if you have a specific thing that you would like to see a tutorial on, then please get in touch and suggest it, and I'll consider making a video about it. So, thank you very much for watching this series, and I hope it was helpful.